They tell me I should be proud of my service. 43 years pulling the lanyard on Earthshaker Cannons, 11 campaigns across 9 worlds, and enough shells fired to depopulate a hive spire twice over. I should feel something when they pin medals to my chest, when the young conscripts look at me with something between fear and reverence, when the commissars nod in my direction as if acknowledging a fellow professional. I should feel proud. Instead, I feel the ringing. It never stops now. It started as a nuisance, after my first week in the gun pits of Valaris Secundus, a high whine that would fade after a few hours of silence. Now it is my constant companion, a chorus that drowns out sermons and screams alike, a sound that has become indistinguishable from my own thoughts. The Medicae officers tell me I am deaf in my left ear and severely impaired in my right. They tell me this with their mouths moving slowly, exaggerating each syllable, and I read their lips more than I hear their voices. What they cannot tell me is why the ringing sometimes sounds like words. What they cannot explain is why, in the quiet moments between bombardments, I sometimes hear coordinates being whispered in frequencies that no voxcaster transmits. I keep count. I have always kept count, not of the shells, though the Munitorum tracks those obsessively, each one stamped and logged and accounted for in ledgers that stretch back millennia, not of the days, though they blur together into one endless stretch of smoke and thunder. I count something else, something I started tallying in my first month of service and have never been able to stop. The number is 2,412,917. I will explain what it means before this confession ends, though I suspect you will wish I had not. Some knowledge is heavier than artillery shells, and it falls upon the soul with far greater devastation. My name is Torvus Kale, and I was born in the underhive of Tertius Majoris, a world so thoroughly industrialized that sunlight was considered a luxury reserved for the upper spire aristocracy. I never saw a natural sky until I was 19 years old, the day they loaded me onto a bulk transport with 8,000 other conscripts and shipped us off to the Valaris system. I remember thinking the stars were beautiful. I remember believing that service to the Emperor would give my life meaning, would elevate me from the nothing I had been into something worthy. The Munitorum processing facility sorted us by aptitude, and I tested well for calculation and spatial reasoning, skills honed by years of working maintenance on the underhive's recycling systems. They assigned me to artillery. I thought it was a blessing. I was wrong, but not in the way you might expect. Artillery duty did not kill me. It did something far worse. It let me live. The Basilisk is a beautiful machine if you have the eyes to appreciate it. I did not, at first. To my underhive sensibilities, it was simply enormous. A tracked chassis supporting an Earthshaker cannon capable of hurling shells over 15 kilometers with devastating accuracy. Our crew was 5 men strong, the standard complement for a mobile artillery piece. Sergeant Corvin led us, a grizzled veteran of the Arcadian campaigns who spoke in clipped sentences and never wasted a word. Loder Venek was a giant of a man from an agri-world, shoulders broad enough to muscle shells into the breach without mechanical assistance during emergencies. Spotter Race handled the augury equipment and communicated with forward observers. Driver Thule kept us moving, kept us alive when counter-battery fire found our position. And me, I was the gunner. I aimed. I calculated. I pulled the lanyard that sent death screaming across the sky. Our first engagement was against an orc warband that had infested the northern manufactorums of Valaris Secundus. I remember the coordinates coming through the Vox, crisp and clinical, numbers that meant nothing to me beyond their mathematical relationships. I remember dialing in the elevation, adjusting for wind speed and atmospheric density, confirming my calculations against the cogitator's recommendations. I remember pulling the lanyard. The sound was beyond description. Even through my ear protection, it was physical, a concussive wave that shook my bones and left my vision swimming. The recoil rocked the entire vehicle, stabilizers groaning in protest, and then the shell was gone, arcing up into the grey sky, falling toward a target I could not see, would never see, Did not need to see. That was the first number I counted. 1. Venek was the one who taught me to count properly. After our third day of continuous bombardment, as we lay in our bedrolls waiting for resupply, he told me something that I have never forgotten. He said that every shell we fired was an average of 37 lives. He had calculated it himself, extrapolating from casualty reports, explosive yield projections, and population density estimates for the types of targets we were assigned. 37 human beings, or their equivalent in Xeno's biomass, for every pull of my lanyard. He was not judging me. He was simply stating a fact, the way an engine wright might state the fuel consumption rate of a Prometheum engine. That night, I began my count. I multiplied the shells I had fired by 37, and the number became my penance, my ledger, my confession. 111 lives in 3 days. I was 19 years old. Venek was the first to hear the voices. I did not believe him at first, and neither did the rest of the crew. We had all developed some degree of tinnitus by then, a occupational hazard that the Munitorum considered acceptable losses. Venek claimed his ringing had begun to take shape, that in the moments after each shot, when the echo was still rolling across the landscape, he could hear whispers beneath the fading thunder. He said they sounded like numbers, like coordinates, like prayers being read backward. Sergeant Corvan told him to speak with the regimental confessor. Venek refused. He said the voices were not heresy. He said they were echoes, remnants of the souls we had killed, screaming their final positions back at us so we would know exactly where they died. We laughed at him. We called him shell-shocked, cannon-touched, blast-addled. We did not understand that Venek was simply further along the path than the rest of us, that given enough time, enough shells, enough screaming thunder, we would all begin to hear what he heard. The valorous campaign lasted 3 years. I fired 6,412 shells. I counted 237,244 lives. I was transferred twice, moved between batteries as attrition claimed my crewmates and new faces replaced the old. Corvan died in a counter-battery strike that I only survived because I had stepped away to relieve myself in a drainage ditch. Race was killed by a stray orc round during a close assault on our position, his head simply ceasing to exist between one heartbeat and the next. Thul went mad after driving over a refugee column that had wandered onto our supply route in the dark, his screams about the bumps lasting until a commissar's bolt pistol silenced them. Venek disappeared. That is the only word for it. One morning he was there, loading shells with his usual mechanical precision. By evening, his bedroll was empty, his kit undisturbed, and no one could account for his whereabouts. The regimental roll listed him as a deserter, but I knew better. Venek had gone to find the source of the voices. I often wonder if he succeeded, and whether success was worse than failure. By the time the Valoris campaign concluded, I was a sergeant myself, commanding a crew of fresh conscripts who looked at me with the same mixture of fear and reverence that I had once directed at Corvan. The ringing in my ears had become constant, a background hum that spiked to painful intensity during fire missions. The Medicae officers fitted me with audio-dampening implants, crude devices that reduced external sound to a manageable murmur while doing nothing to quiet the internal noise. I learned to read lips. I learned to watch for the muzzle flash that preceded orders I could no longer hear clearly. I learned to count on my fingers when the numbers in my head became too large to track mentally, scratching tally marks into the metal frame of my gunner's seat like a prisoner marking days on a cell wall. The new crew thought I was eccentric. The veterans who remembered the early days thought I was cursed. Neither group was entirely wrong. My second campaign was on Callistus 7, a shrine world that had fallen to heretical rebellion. The enemy was not Xenos, but human, which should have made it easier. It did not. We were assigned to siege operations, reducing fortified positions that the heretics had constructed around sacred sites they had defiled with their false worship. The targeting coordinates came through the Vox with the same clinical precision as always, but now they were accompanied by designations I recognized. names of temples and monasteries that I had seen in illuminated manuscripts during my brief religious education. We were firing on holy ground, shattering sanctuaries that had stood for thousands of years, turning places of worship into charnel houses. I asked Sergeant Major Vedras if this was truly the Emperor's will. He looked at me with eyes that held no doubt, no hesitation, and told me that the Emperor's will was expressed through the chain of command, and the chain of command told us to fire. I pulled the lanyard. I added to my count. It was on Kaelistis 7 that I first noticed the targeting anomaly. We received coordinates for a fire mission against what was designated as a heretic command bunker in Sector Gamma 12. I calculated the trajectory, adjusted for the mountain winds that plagued this region, and prepared to fire. But something about the coordinates bothered me. They placed the target in a valley that our reconnaissance maps showed as uninhabited, a farming region that had been evacuated weeks before the siege began. I mentioned this to Vedras, who checked with Fire Control Command. The coordinates were confirmed. I fired. I added 37 to my count. 3 days later, I saw the after-action report. The target had been a refugee camp, displaced civilians who had fled the fighting and established a temporary settlement in what they believed was a safe zone. 1,100 dead. The report listed them as heretic sympathizers, collateral damage acceptable within mission parameters. I did not believe that. I had read the original evacuation orders. Those people had been moved to that valley by Imperial authorities. Someone had sent them there, and then someone had sent us the coordinates to destroy them. I asked no more questions. I had learned what happened to those who questioned the chain of command. I pulled the lanyard, and I counted. The targeting anomaly reappeared throughout the Kaelistis campaign. Not every fire mission, not even most of them, but enough to form a pattern that I could not ignore. Coordinates that did not match known enemy positions. Targets designated as military infrastructure that turned out to be civilian housing blocks, medical facilities, food distribution centers. Each time, the after-action reports justified the strikes, classified the dead as combatants or collaborators, closed the books on another successful mission. Each time, I added to my count, and the number grew heavier. By the end of Kaelistis 7, I had fired over 8,000 shells. I had counted over 300,000 lives. I was 31 years old, and I had killed more people than the entire population of the Underhive level where I was born. I told myself it was war. I told myself it was duty. I told myself that the Emperor required sacrifice, and that I was merely the instrument of his will. The ringing in my ears grew louder, and sometimes, in the quiet moments, I thought I heard Venek's voice among the whispers, asking if I had started counting yet, asking if I understood what the numbers meant. My third campaign was where everything changed. We were deployed to Carthax Prime, an industrial world that had been invaded by a splinter fleet of tyrannid organisms. This was clean war, righteous war, war against an enemy that was unambiguously inhuman and deserving of annihilation. I welcomed the simplicity. For the first time in years, I fired without guilt, poured shells into seething masses of chitin and claw, watched the distant explosions bloom against waves of alien flesh that threatened to overwhelm our defensive lines. The counting continued, but it felt different. These were not lives I was ending, not in any sense that mattered. They were organisms, biological weapons, threats to human survival that needed to be eliminated with extreme prejudice. I rediscovered something like pride in my work. I led my crew with renewed vigor, pushing them to faster reload times, better accuracy, more shells per hour than any other battery in the regiment. Command noticed. Command approved. Command gave us special assignments. The special coordinates first appeared during the siege of Hive Primus. We had been hammering tyrannid positions for 3 weeks straight, our Earthshaker running so hot that the barrel required replacement twice. Then a sealed order came through the command vox, encrypted with ciphers that only senior officers could decode. My battery commander, Captain Lorath, read the order with a face that revealed nothing. He passed the coordinates to me personally, which was unusual. Fire control normally handled targeting data. He told me to calculate the trajectory myself, to trust no one else with the numbers. He told me that this mission was classified at the highest levels, that we were striking a target of strategic importance, that the success of the entire campaign might depend on our accuracy. I believed him. I calculated. I fired. The shell arced over the Tyrannid lines, over the burning suburbs of Hive Primus, and detonated somewhere in the industrial sector beyond. The next day, I heard rumors that an entire manufactorum complex had been destroyed, along with the 3,000 workers still operating its forges. Friendly fire, the official explanation said. Tragic, but unavoidable in the chaos of war. The coordinates I had been given were not Tyrannid positions. They were Imperial facilities. I confronted Captain Loreth in his command tent. I should not have. I should have kept my mouth shut, done my duty, pulled my lanyard without question like a proper instrument of the Emperor's will. But the count had grown too large, the weight too heavy, and I needed to understand. Loreth did not deny what had happened. He did not try to explain it away or classify it as collateral damage. He looked at me with eyes that had seen far more than mine, and he told me a truth that I wish I had never learned. He said that, in every war, there are targets that cannot be officially designated, collaborators who might testify against their betters, witnesses to actions that must remain hidden, populations whose loyalty is suspect and whose elimination is more efficient than their rehabilitation. He said that artillery exists precisely because it provides distance, deniability, and the comfortable fiction that shells fall where the enemy stands. He said that I had been selected for these special assignments because my count showed I would follow orders, that I would fire where I was told to fire, that I would not ask questions that might complicate the chain of command. He said that the war against the Tyranids was real, but that within every war there were other wars being fought, shadow conflicts where the enemy wore Imperial uniforms and the victories were measured in silence rather than territory. He offered me a choice. I could continue as I had been, following orders, accepting special assignments, rising through the ranks toward a comfortable position far from the gun pits, or I could refuse and discover what happened to those who knew too much and could not be trusted to remain silent. I chose to continue. I pulled my lanyard. I counted. What else could I do? I was a weapon, and weapons do not choose their targets. I told myself this, repeated it like a prayer, made it my catechism during the long hours between fire missions. The ringing in my ears grew louder, and the whispers beneath it began to take recognizable shapes. Not Vennek's voice anymore, but others, dozens of them, hundreds, a chorus of the dead reciting coordinates back to me, confirming trajectories, acknowledging impacts. I stopped trying to distinguish between the voices in my head and the orders coming through the Vox. They said the same things anyway. Fire here, fire there, add to the count. The number passed 500,000 during the final assault on Hive Primus. 500,000 lives, calculated at Vennek's ratio of 37 per shell. I scratched the tally into my gunner's seat until there was no more room, then started marking the inner surface of my helmet, tiny lines that no one else would ever see or understand. I was 38 years old. I was a weapon. I was learning to be content with that. The Carthax campaign ended with Imperial victory, the Tyrannid splinter fleet destroyed, the world reclaimed for the Emperor's domain. I received commendations, promotions, reassignments to training cadres where I was expected to pass on my expertise to the next generation of artillery crews. I taught young men and women how to calculate trajectories, how to maintain their weapons, how to survive the thunder that would define their service. I did not teach them to count. I did not teach them about the special assignments, the shadow wars, the coordinates that came sealed and encrypted. Some lessons have to be learned through experience. Some weights have to be discovered rather than described. I watched them during their first live fire exercises, saw their faces when the Earthshaker roared for the first time, recognized the mixture of terror and exhilaration that I had once felt myself. Most of them would be dead within a year. The survivors would begin to hear the ringing. The exceptional ones would learn to count, and the truly cursed ones, the ones like me, would eventually discover that the ringing was not just noise but language, that the dead had been talking to us all along, and that we had been too deafened by the thunder to listen. I was 42 when I first understood what the voices were saying. It happened during a routine training exercise, a demonstration firing for a delegation of Munitorum officials who wanted to see our new conscripts in action. I was not even on a crew, merely supervising from an observation platform as my students went through the motions I had taught them 100 times. The Earthshaker fired, and in the moment after the blast, when the echo was rolling across the practice range and the ringing in my ears reached its familiar crescendo, I heard it clearly for the first time. A coordinate. Not one I had ever fired on, not one that appeared in any target database I had access to. Just 8 numbers, precise to the meter, designating a location somewhere far from this world, far from any war I had ever fought. The voice that spoke it was not Venek's. It was mine. My voice, speaking from some future or past that I could not identify, giving myself targeting data for a mission that had not yet been assigned. I did not understand. I did not need to understand. I wrote the coordinate down and waited for it to become relevant. 3 years passed. I was transferred to the Cadian sector, assigned to a garrison battery defending a fortress world against the ever-present threat of chaos incursion from the Eye of Terror. The work was routine, mostly training exercises and maintenance schedules, with occasional live fire missions against cultist uprisings in the outer provinces. I continued to count, though the numbers came more slowly now. I continued to hear the voices, though they spoke less frequently, as if conserving their energy for messages of particular importance. The coordinate I had written down remained folded in my breast pocket, 8 numbers that meant nothing until the day they meant everything. I was 45 years old, a senior gunnery instructor with 4 decades of experience, when the sealed orders arrived from Sector Command. Special assignment. Strategic target. Coordinates encrypted with ciphers that only I could decode, because I had been carrying them next to my heart for 3 years. The numbers matched. The location existed. The order was given. I was to fire on a target that I had designated for myself. Before I knew it existed, I should have refused. I should have questioned, investigated, demanded explanations from officers who would never have provided them. But I was a weapon, and weapons do not refuse their firing orders. I calculated the trajectory across distances that should have been impossible for a single Earthshaker shell, across void spaces that no conventional munition could traverse. The mathematics did not work. The physics denied every principle I had been taught. Yet when I entered the coordinates into my cogitator, the machine accepted them without complaint, displayed a firing solution that curved through dimensions I could not perceive, projected an impact point that existed nowhere in real space. I understood then what Venek had discovered, what the voices had been trying to teach me all along. The shells we fired did not simply travel through the air and detonate on the ground. They traveled through everything, through reality itself, and their echoes reached places that no map could describe. Every shell I had ever fired was still falling somewhere, still detonating in some distant corner of existence, still killing targets that had never been designated. The count was infinite. The count had always been infinite, and now the count was requesting a specific addition, a shell aimed at coordinates that had been whispered to me by my own voice, traveling backward through time to ensure that I would fire it forward. I pulled the lanyard. The shell departed, and in its wake, I heard a new sound beneath the ringing. Not coordinates, not numbers, not the voices of the dead reciting their final positions. I heard applause, distant, echoing, appreciative applause from an audience that had been watching my entire career, waiting for this specific moment, this specific shell, this specific addition to account that they had been tallying alongside me. I did not know who they were. I did not know what I had hit. I only knew that the special assignments had never been random, never been shadow wars or political eliminations or convenient accidents. They had been preparations, calibrations, test firings to ensure that when this moment came, I would be capable of making a shot that no other artillery crew in the Imperium could make. I was not a weapon. I was the weapon, singular and specific. 43 years in the forging. The aftermath was quiet. No after-action report came through command channels. No commendations or condemnations arrived from sector headquarters. My battery continued its routine operations as if nothing unusual had occurred. But I noticed changes. Officers who had previously ignored me now nodded in my direction with something like respect or fear. Requisition requests that had been denied for years were suddenly approved without explanation. My transfer orders, which should have rotated me to a rear echelon position given my age and hearing impairment, were cancelled indefinitely. I was to remain at my post, my Earthshaker, my lanyard. I was to wait for the next sealed order, the next special assignment, the next coordinate whispered to me by voices that I could no longer distinguish from my own thoughts. I was 45 years old. I had counted 1,700,000 lives. And I was beginning to suspect that the count was merely a down payment on a debt that would never be fully paid. The years that followed blurred together more than ever before. Campaigns on worlds whose names I never learned, against enemies that I never saw, firing shells at coordinates that came to me in dreams, as often as through official channels. My crews changed around me, young faces aging into middle age, middle-aged faces disappearing into the vast accounting of imperial attrition, but I remained constant, the fixed point around which the battery rotated. They called me the Immortal, not because I could not die, but because I seemed to refuse to. Surviving counter-battery strikes and close assaults and accidents that claimed everyone around me, I did not feel immortal. I felt eroded, worn down by each thunderclap until there was nothing left of the person I had been, only the function I performed. I aimed, I calculated, I pulled the lanyard, I counted 1,800,000, 1,900,000, 2 million. The number lost all meaning at that scale, became just another piece of data to be recorded and forgotten, another tally mark scratched into the inside of a helmet that I had stopped replacing because the marks were the only proof that I existed. Venek came back to me in my 62nd year of life. Not in person, not as a ghost or a hallucination, but as a voice among the voices, distinct and recognizable after all these decades. He spoke my name first, which none of the other voices had ever done. He told me that he had found what he was looking for, that the source of the voices was not the dead, but something far older and far more patient. He told me that the shells we fired were prayers, that each detonation was an offering to entities that existed in the spaces between explosions, that our counts were not ledgers of guilt but tallies of devotion. He told me that I had been chosen, just as he had been chosen, just as every artillery crew in the history of the Imperium had been chosen without knowing it. He told me that the final coordinate was coming, the one that would complete my service, the one that would add the last number to my count and allow me to rest. He told me that I would know it when I heard it, because I would have spoken it myself, in a voice that belonged to the person I had not yet become. Then he was gone, and the ringing resumed its normal chaos, and I continued my work because there was nothing else to do. The final coordinate came on a morning like any other. I was performing maintenance on my Earthshaker, oiling components that had been replaced dozens of times over the decades, checking calibrations that my hands knew better than my conscious mind. The sealed order arrived through the command vox, encrypted with ciphers that resolved into numbers I recognized instantly. Not because I had written them down years ago, not because they matched some previous assignment. I recognized them because they described my current position, the exact coordinates of my battery emplacement, the precise location where I stood with my hands still covered in lubricating oil and my ears still filled with the ringing that had been my companion for 4 decades. I was the target. I had always been the target. The infinite count of shells still falling through reality included one that was aimed at me, fired by my own hand at some point in my service, traveling through dimensions and across time to arrive at this specific moment. I was to complete the circuit. I was to pull the lanyard one final time and add myself to the count. I calculated the trajectory. It was impossible, of course. A shell cannot strike its own firing position. The mathematics forbade it, but the cogitator accepted the coordinates without complaint, displayed a solution that curved through spaces I could perceive now, because my eyes had been opened by decades of thunder, projected an impact point that was everywhere and nowhere, and specifically here. I loaded the shell myself, the way Venek had taught me during those first weeks on Valoris Secundus, using muscles that remembered their purpose even as my mind questioned it. I dialed in the elevation, adjusted for wind speed and atmospheric density and the curvature of realities that intersected at this single point in space and time. I checked my calculations against the cogitator's recommendations. I found them perfect. I found myself perfect, honed by 43 years of service into an instrument capable of this one impossible shot. My crew watched from a safe distance, ordered to stand down for maintenance that I had claimed I needed to perform alone. They did not understand what they were witnessing. They did not know that this was my final examination, my last addition to a count that had defined my existence. I thought of Sergeant Corvin, who had taught me discipline. I thought of Venek, who had taught me to count. I thought of all the crews I had served with and outlived, all the faces that had blurred together into a single expression of dutiful compliance. I thought of the 2,412,916 lives I had taken, multiplied at Venek's ratio, scratched into helmets and gun frames and the inside of my own skull. I thought of the shadow wars, and the special assignments, and the coordinates that came sealed and encrypted. I thought of the voice that had spoken from my future, ensuring that this moment would arrive, ensuring that I would be ready when it did. I pulled the lanyard. The Earthshaker roared one final time, and the shell departed on a trajectory that existed only in the spaces between mathematics and madness. I watched it climb, arc, begin its descent toward a target that was me and not me, a position that I occupied and had already vacated. The ringing in my ears reached a crescendo, and within it I heard every voice I had ever heard, every coordinate I had ever received, every count I had ever made, all speaking at once in a harmony that was almost beautiful. Venek was there, Corvan was there, 2,412,916 individual voices, each one saying thank you, each one acknowledging the offering I had made on their behalf, each one adding their number to a final tally that would never be complete, because completion was not the point. Service was the point. Counting was the point. Pulling the lanyard was the point. The shell struck, and I discovered what Venek had discovered, what the voices had been trying to teach me since my first day in the gun pits of Valoris Secundus. I did not die. I transformed. The explosion tore through my body and left something else in its place, something that was still Torvus Kale, but was also every shell I had ever fired, every life I had ever counted, every coordinate I had ever calculated. I became the ringing. I became the echo. I became the voice that would whisper to future artillery crews, giving them targets they did not understand, preparing them for shots they did not know they would make, adding their counts to a sum that stretched back to the first cannon ever fired in humanity's name and forward to the last shell that would ever fall. The number is infinite. The number has always been infinite, and I am still counting. My body remained at my post. I know this because I can see it sometimes, between the detonations that are my new existence, a withered figure, still pulling lanyards, still calculating trajectories, still scratching tally marks into surfaces that will never run out of room. They call that figure the immortal. They do not know that immortality is not a blessing but a function, that I cannot die because I am no longer alive in any sense that matters, that my service continues in forms that the Munitorum does not track, and the Administratum cannot classify. I fire shells that have not yet been manufactured at targets that have not yet been born. I count lives that will not exist for millennia, adding them to a ledger that grows heavier with each entry. I whisper coordinates to crews across the galaxy, my voice hidden beneath the ringing that every artillery soldier learns to ignore. guiding their hands toward shots that will seem random but are anything but. 2,412,917. That is the number I promised to explain, the final entry on my count before I ceased to be a man and became something else. It is not the total of lives I have taken, though that number is close enough to serve as approximation. It is the number of artillery crews I have spoken to since my transformation, the number of lanyards I have guided, the number of prayers I have helped deliver to the entities that exist in the spaces between explosions. Each one of those crews will eventually make their own count, fire their own final shot. Join me in this endless chorus of ringing and recitation. Some will take decades, like I did. Some will reach their number within months, their talent for killing so pronounced that they accelerate through the curriculum I took 43 years to complete. All of them will serve. All of them will count. All of them will pull the lanyard one final time and discover that the end is merely another form of beginning. They tell me I should be proud of my service. They are right, but not for the reasons they believe. I am proud because I was chosen, because my count was significant enough to earn me a place in this hierarchy of thunder, because my voice now joins the voices that guided me and will guide those who come after. I am proud because the Emperor requires instruments, and I have become one of his most faithful, firing eternally in his name, even though I suspect he has never known I exist. I am proud because Venek found what he was looking for, and now I have found it too, and the finding was worth every shell, every count, every life, reduced to a number on a ledger that exists only in the ringing between my ears. The brutal life of a Basilisk artillery crewman ends the same way for all of us. We pull the lanyard, and we become the shell, and we fall forever toward targets we can finally see. The count continues. The count is everything. And if you listen closely, in the silence after the thunder fades, you might hear me whispering your coordinates, preparing you for the shot you do not yet know you will make. I am still counting. I will always be counting. And soon, so will you.